Something that's dysfunctional, it means it's not working the way it's supposed to. It's not operating the way it was intended to operate. You might be thinking about your car. When it's not running the way it's supposed to, it's dysfunctional. You may have an appliance in your kitchen. Maybe your refrigerator's not keeping anything cold. It's not keeping things frozen. It's dysfunctioning. It's not working right. One of the ways that we can also see dysfunction play out is in our relationships. We can have dysfunctional relationships with other people. Sometimes we hear that word attached to the word family. We think about dysfunctional families, and when I say that, you may even think of one that comes to mind. You may be a family you know, a real life family that you would say is dysfunctional. It could be one you think about on TV or in a movie that it comes across as being dysfunctional. Sad to say, you may even be thinking about your own family. Now, if we think about a dysfunctional family, what are some things that are happening in that family relationship? What's happening? What's being done that's causing hurt feelings? What's being done that's caused hardness or a brokenness in that family? It could be lies that are being told. It could be some level of unfaithfulness. It could be a moral lapse that's going on in that family. It could be external pressures like job or school, any number of things that could cause a family not to work the way that we think it's supposed to. Well, today as we continue in our series in the book of Genesis, we're following down the family line of Abraham. And today we're getting to his descendant, Jacob. Now, in this part of Jacob's life, we're going to find that he, as well as others in his family, were wheeling and dealing in order to try to get God's blessings. I'm going to give you a quick recap just to kind of catch us up, not only from last week, but also to fill in some of the gaps. Isaac, from last time, has grown up and he's married a woman named Rebekah. When Rebekah becomes pregnant, the Lord tells her that her children would be two nations, that one would be stronger than the other, and the older would serve the younger. Well, she ended up having twins, one named Esau and one named Jacob. Esau was the firstborn, but coming right after Esau, even clutching his heel, was Jacob coming right after. Now, Rebekah and Isaac, the parents, they were playing favorites. Rebekah favored, or she loved, Jacob more. Isaac, on the other hand, loved Esau. Now, Esau is in between the stories to bring us up to date. Esau, later on when he grew up, he actually gave away his birthright. What was due him as firstborn son, he gave that up to Jacob for all things, a bowl of stew, for some food. Now, I know that's hard for us to imagine, but that's really what happened. So that real quick recap, that background, brings us up to the passage today in Genesis chapter 27. This chapter here shows us what we would call a dysfunctional family who are trying to carry out their goals by their own schemes and their own conniving and their own methods instead of just having faith in God. A popular internet term is TLDR, which means too long didn't read. So the too long didn't read version of this is that Jacob got the blessing from his father Isaac by deception. But now Jacob's not the only one in the story that was dysfunctional. The whole family took part of it. They were all at fault. And this account sounds really like a made-for-TV movie. This is a very dramatic and a very interesting story that we're going to read today. Now, just to set up the characters who are in play, we have the father, his name is Isaac, who certainly knew that God had already made a statement. God had already made a declaration in the past. We find it in Genesis 25:23. Where God had told Rebekah this, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 people will come from you and be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. This foretold that Esau would end up serving his younger brother, Jacob. So God had already put that out there. He had already made that declaration. Well, Isaac, the father, set out to foil God's plan by his intention to give Esau his blessing instead. Now Esau, he agreed with his father Isaac's plan. He agreed that he would receive the blessing instead of his brother Jacob. Even though at that point he was breaking an oath that he had sworn to Jacob back in Genesis chapter 25, where he had given Jacob his birthright. Remember, we mentioned that already, for a bowl of stew, for some food. So Esau was going against the oath that he made to his brother Jacob. So then that also brings in the mother and the other son, Rebekah and Jacob. Each of those two were trying to get God's blessings, and which had already been promised by God that it was going to happen. It was going to be coming to Jacob, but they were trying to speed up God's plan. They were trying to get what God had already promised through trickery and through deception. Their plan would end up working, as we find out, but it would cause Esau to hate his brother Jacob, to hate him to the point where he wanted to kill him. And that would cause Jacob to have to flee, to get away from the danger from Esau. And Rebekah would end up never seeing her son Jacob, the one that she loved. She would never see him again. So this conflict between Jacob and Esau, it was fueled by Jacob's desire for this blessing that was due Esau as the firstborn, but that God had already promised would come to him. So this story, though, is not just about Jacob. We have all these other characters. We have Isaac, we have Rebekah, and we have Esau. So Jacob didn't destroy this family alone. His parents and his brother did their part as well. So we're going to explore this account as we see several scenes unfold. And what we find in addition to this plotting and this scheming is just how fragmented this family had become, how dysfunctional, how broken this family had really come when you look at their relationships with each other and ultimately their relationship with God. This account is really too long for us to read in Genesis 27. So remember, as always, go back and read this for yourself. Read this word for yourself. Just don't take my word for it. So we are going to read parts of it. We're not going to read the whole passage. So let's begin with this first scene. We see this in Genesis chapter 27. And here we see the coming crisis, what's coming ahead. So Genesis 27, beginning in verse 1, it says, "When Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could not see, he called his older son Esau and said to him, 'My son.' And he answered, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Look, I am old and do not know the day of my death. Take your hunting gear, your quiver and bow, go out in the field to hunt some game for me. Then make me a delicious meal that I love, and bring it to me to eat, so that I can bless you before I die.'" So Isaac is given his plan here. Isaac is going to offer to bless Esau, which was against God's plan, but which was technically owed him as firstborn. And remember, Esau was Isaac's favorite son. So he tells his son here, Esau, to go out, because he's a hunter, go out and hunt some game and fix me a delicious meal so that I can enjoy it and so that I can bless you before I die. Isaac's getting old and he's losing his sight. He's losing some of his senses, I guess you'd say. And he's saying, let me have this opportunity to give you this blessing before I pass on. And that was the dilemma that would end up prompting Rebekah and Jacob to put their plan into place. Because in this next scene, we find Rebekah had overheard this account. Rebekah had overheard what Isaac had said to Esau. So we go on and look down in verse 5, we see Rebekah and Jacob begin to plot. Remember, I said this is like a made-for-TV movie. Down in verse 5, it says that Rebekah was listening to what Isaac said to his son Esau. So while Esau went to the field to hunt some game to bring in, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Listen, I heard your father talking with your brother Esau. He said, 'Bring me the game and make a delicious meal for me to eat so I can bless you in the Lord's presence before I die. Now obey every order I give you, my son. Go to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats, and I will make them into a delicious meal for your father, the kind he loves. Then take it to your father to eat so that he may bless you before he dies.'" You see, Rebekah's plan here, the mother's plan, was to trick this old guy, to trick her husband, to trick her son's father, Isaac, into thinking that he was blessing Esau instead. And while he would actually be blessing Jacob. So here's the plot. Here's the deception that really begins to boil up. Now, even though they might have been able to replicate that meal, and he might have eaten it and said, "Oh, this is delicious, just the meal that I wanted," Jacob wasn't so sure that this plan was going to work, because him and Esau were different people. It says there in that chapter 27 that Esau was hairy. I guess he had hairy arms. But that Jacob was not. That Jacob was smooth-skinned. And Jacob was worried that if his father touched him, then he would know the difference and he would know that something was wrong. Because remember, Isaac's eyesight was getting bad. So Jacob didn't seem really here to have a problem or any regrets about tricking his father. He didn't really seem to have a problem with the tricking. He was just worried that he might get caught. So what happens? Well, Rebekah persuades him that it would work, that this plan is going to work, son, if you would dress up like your brother Esau. Go and get some of his clothes, put on his clothing, And that she even prepared to have animal skins that he could put on himself, to put on his arms, so that if his father Isaac reached out and touched him, he would feel hair. He would feel the fur and think, well, this must be my son Esau. So what did Jacob do? Well, he obeyed his mother. He put on Esau's clothes, and then he went in to steal the blessing. Now, in this next scene, we have Jacob now with his father Isaac. Remember, Esau, where's he at right now? Well, he's out hunting. He's out hunting game for his father. So Jacob and Isaac are together. And Jacob does, in fact, end up tricking his father into giving him his blessing. And what we see here in chapter 27 is that Jacob ended up lying to his father at least 2 times here. First of all, he lied about his identity. He said, yes, I'm your son Esau. Yes, that's who I am. But he also lied about God, that God had given him success in his hunting. Now look, let's admit it. Any lie is bad, correct? You agree with that? Any lie is bad. It's bad enough that Jacob was lying here to his father. But then what does he do? He brings God into the deception as well. And he said, oh, God blessed me in my hunting. Now remember, Jacob didn't go hunting, right? His mother, Rebekah, they took some from their own flock and she prepared the meal. So Jacob is lying to his father about who he is, and he's lying about God being with him to give him a successful hunt. Now, even though Isaac, and we read through this story, when you read it for yourself, you'll see Isaac, he was suspicious. He did have some head scratching going on. There's some questioning back and forth about, is this really my son Esau? But finally, he believed that that was Esau that was coming to him, and he gave Jacob the blessing instead. Let's look here and read in chapter 27, verse 27, and this is the blessing that Jacob received, that his father was going to give Esau. He said, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. So you see right there, he thought this was Esau. In verse 28, may God give to you from the dew of the sky and from the richness of the land an abundance of grain and new wine. May people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brothers. May your mother's sons bow down to you. Those who curse you will be cursed, and those who bless you will be blessed. That was the all-important blessing that Jacob received from his father. Now, as we go on and we try to finish up this dramatic story that's happening here in the Bible that's recorded, in this last scene, beginning in verse 30, the wheels finally start to come off of this trickery, and the family becomes even more divided, even more dysfunctional, because now we bring Esau back into the picture. He has actually had a successful hunt, unlike Jacob, who just lied about it. Esau has come back, he's prepared that game, he's fixed a delicious meal, and he returns with this food that he prepared for his father, and he brings it in there, but all of a sudden, Isaac's like, wait a minute, didn't we just do this? Didn't you just bring me a meal? Didn't I just eat it? Haven't I already blessed you? So naturally, Isaac, even though he's getting older, he realized that something is up, that something is wrong. It became clear what had happened, and it said there that Isaac began to tremble uncontrollably. Maybe that was rage, maybe it was fear, maybe it was confusion, whatever it was. And Esau cried out, it said, and he was so hurt, and he was so angry that it said he was to the point where he was ready to kill his own brother, Jacob, because of this deception, because of this theft of the blessing. Isaac must have realized at this point that he had been caught, because he was doing something wrong too, right? God had already declared that Jacob was going to was to be the one that was going to be blessed, that the older was going to serve the younger, that Esau would serve Jacob. So Isaac had already realized that the game was up. He had been caught in what he was trying to do in terms of trying to usurp God's plan by giving the blessing to Esau. Instead, what Isaac realized is that no matter how hard he tried, no matter what scheme he had planned, that God had overruled him. That God's plan was what was going to actually come to fruition. So just as God had already declared, Isaac ended up making the blessing to Jacob instead of Esau. Isaac unintentionally made Jacob Esau's master. Now, so what was Esau left with? Well, he asks his father, can't you give me something? Can't you give me another blessing? He couldn't take the one back that he gave Jacob. So what his father, only thing his father could do ultimately was to give him what we might call an anti-blessing. And that's what we read in the rest of the story here. That the descendants of Esau, which are later known as the Edomites, and we read about them in other books of the Bible, They would end up living in a barren land, whereas Jacob and his descendants would live in a fertile land. That the Edomites, Esau and his descendants, would live in a land that was barren, that was unfertile. That they would live by violence. They would live by the sword. They would live by force. They would be controlled by Jacob's descendants, and they would remain restless. They would be wandering. They wouldn't be able to settle down until they were finally able to break free from Jacob and his descendants. Now, when we think about those scenes, when we think about this story and where it's taken us, if we look on it, it looks like we could say, well, Rebekah and Jacob won, right? They came out on top. What they planned on happening, Jacob receiving the blessing, is what happened. So we look at them and say, well, they must have won because they got what they went after. But really, they gained nothing from God. And this is really important. Listen to this. Rebekah and Jacob gained absolutely nothing that God had not already promised and planned to give them. And see, that's very important. They were going out and trying to get what God had already promised was going to come to them. They were fighting against God's timing, and they were fighting against God's purposes and God's plans. Instead of looking at it and saying, well, they got everything they wanted, they really brought more turmoil into the family than existed before, the way they went about things. Jacob would end up having to flee for his life, and his mother, who loved him, would never see him again. So what this account really should make us realize is how ridiculous it is, and how futile it is for us to try to take over or assume the plans of God, to try to put ourselves in the place of God and how things are going to unfold. Jacob would have to learn a little on later down the road, and we'll get to this story later on in another video. Jacob will have to learn a little farther down the road that God's blessings come by faith, not by tricks, not by lies and deception, not by scheming, but simply by faith. And that leads us really to our key, to the big idea from the story. And there's a lot of different things we could look at the story and pull from it. But I think this is what the original, intent of this recording was for us to understand, is that we don't have to scheme to get God's blessings. We simply have to be obedient to Him. God had already promised a blessing to Jacob, but his family, his mom, his brother and his father, they went about all their own ways to try to overrule what God had already said was going to happen. Behind all this scheming and all this plotting that we read in this account, we still see the sovereign Lord still at work. He worked even in the failures and all the faults of the people involved in this story. God is going to accomplish. Right? This is just a biblical truth. This is a theological truth that God is always going to accomplish what He chooses to do in spite of our choices, in spite of our faults, in spite of our failures, right? In spite of our plans. God's plans are always going to happen in His timing, right? And in His way. I want to leave you with two questions to think over as we finish up this story. I just want you to think about these two things, if you would. Number one, why should I always do things God's way, even if it doesn't make sense? There may be something in your life that God has brought out to you. There may be some purpose or plan that God has put in front of you. And you're sitting there and you're looking at it and you're trying to reason it. And this is what I do a lot of times. We try to reason it in our own human logic. But we have to step back sometimes and simply say, why should I do this God's way even when it doesn't make sense? Why would we do that? Well, it's because we have faith in God, right? It's because we trust Him. And I hope that you can say that. I hope that you have been walking with God and you've been experiencing God in your life to such a degree that you have developed a faith and a trust in Him that even when you don't understand, that you'll still do as the Lord leads you. So think about that question. Why would you follow God even when it doesn't make sense? And then number two, think about this. Is there anything I've been doing in my way instead of God's way? Is there something that I'm trying to accomplish? Is there something that, maybe it's a ministry in church, maybe it's something in my community, maybe it's even something at home. Am I trying to accomplish something my way instead of God's way? If so, am I willing to make a change, right? Am I willing to make a change, to allow God to change me so that I will be accomplishing it, and I will be pursuing it, and I will be doing it God's way? Whenever God calls us to do anything, and you may say, well, God's never called me to do anything. Well, then that means you haven't experienced His Word, because this is where we find the will of God. This is where we find the moral will of God. We can always know what God wants from us by going to His Word and letting it speak into our life. The question always comes down to, though, once I know His will, do I have the faith, and do I have the trust, and do I have the courage or the desire to follow God's way? I don't think there's any way we can truly do that. Well, I know there's no way we can do that if we don't know God in a very real and very personal way. The Bible tells us the only way we can experience that kind of relationship with God is through a relationship with His Son, Jesus Christ. That's the beginning of faith. It's a belief that leads to faith in His Son, that leads to faith and trust in all of God's promises, that when we come to Him, when we repent of our sin, and we turn to Him, that God will forgive us, that He'll bring into our life the Holy Spirit, and then we can truly be able to trust Him and live for Him completely and totally. Now, that doesn't mean that we're never going to have a question. That doesn't mean we're never going to have an option not to choose to disobey God, because we still do. We still have free will. So remember this, we don't have to scheme, we don't have to plot, we don't have to connive in order to get God's blessings. We simply have to be obedient to Him. Thank you guys for joining this morning in this continuation of this series in Genesis. And tune in next time, and we'll be following along and learning a little bit more about what happened to Jacob later on in his life. As always, let us know in the comments below if there's anything we can pray with you about, anything we can do to help minister and serve you. You guys have an awesome day. Goodbye.